Well, hey, let me ask you this. When you attend a wedding, do you think of it as an ending or as a beginning? I mean, looking back, I think I thought of my own wedding as the end of what seemed like this excruciatingly long wait. We were engaged for less than 6 months, which is brief compared to most young couples today. But when the day finally arrived, I mean, we celebrated as if we had crossed the finish line, right? I mean, family and friends are there to congratulate us, and you know, we had arrived in the state of holy matrimony. But if you turn that around, if you think of a wedding as a beginning of a lifelong race, then all those festivities honestly seem a little bit misplaced. I mean, think of it this way. It'd be like a great crowd gathering at the starting line as runners go to begin a race, and as soon as they step across the start line, people begin to congratulate them, right? As if they've accomplished something. They just stepped across the line, and they start giving them gifts, right? And celebrating and cheering. And then once people begin to move and they head out of sight, everyone goes home. Right? No one checks to see where they're at along the course. No one cheers them on midway. I mean, honestly, today, a lot of people just assume they won't even finish the race. Right? Maybe we need to change the way we think about weddings and marriage a little bit. Well, when we come to Ephesians 5, Paul's teaching about marriage is about running the race. He describes marriage with Christ at the center. And last time we considered the aspirations of a Christ-centered wife. We saw that each one related in some way to this idea of submission. And we sought to define that in a biblical way, not in the way that some people define it in our culture. But what we saw is each of those aspirations in those verses, verses 22 through 24, they tell us something about who Jesus is. And we worked through the application of those a little bit. Well, today we come to Ephesians 5, verse 25, and we're going to try to work our way down through verse 33 today, where Paul turns his attention to husbands. Now, again, he doesn't give us helpful tips on dating and romance. That's not his focus, right? He presents this compelling picture, this theological picture that radically changes the way we think about marriage. Because he challenges us as husbands to make Christ the center of our marriage by loving our wives, here it is, as Jesus loves the church. So specifically, Paul revealed 8 characteristics of Christ-like love that should be reflected in the way a husband loves his wife. Now, again, even though this passage is directed specifically to husbands, the things that we learn about Christ and his love for us, I mean, that helps all of us live in light of what he's done for us. So the application extends beyond husbands, but that's certainly the focus here. Now, the first characteristic of Christ-like love is that it's sacrificial. You know, back in John 15:13, it tells us that Jesus said, "Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends." And so I think when we think of sacrificial love, we envision like one great heroic act, right? That I'm willing to take a bullet for you kind of love. That's sacrificial love, right? And I mean, in the midst of if you were actually in a situation like that, honestly, I think most men would be willing to do that for their wives. But was that really what Jesus had in mind when he talked about laying down your life? I mean, can true sacrifice, is that really just a momentary thing? Isn't it an even greater sacrifice to pour yourself out, not in one heroic action, but drip by drip, day after day? You know, it's the long haul kind of sacrifice that's really significant. And so there in Ephesians 5, verse 25, take a look at it. Paul began his exhortation to husbands by saying, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." Now, when we read that passage, that mention of Christ giving himself up, of course, that reminds us of his crucifixion, and rightly so. I mean, through his death, Jesus paid the price for our sins so that we can be forgiven by God. So in Romans 5:8, for example, Paul specifically links God's love with Christ's sacrifice. He says, "But God shows his love for us, and that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." So the cross is certainly the pinnacle of Christ's love for all of us as the church. But we also need to see that his entire life was characterized by sacrifice. In Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 8, Paul challenged Christians to adopt this sacrificial mindset, this Christ-like mindset. And look at what he says. "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." You see, Jesus gave himself not just in the cross, but he gave himself by becoming human. Right? He gave himself by living a humble life among people who didn't honor him for who he was. He gave himself by caring for the sick and the poor. He gave himself by patiently teaching stubborn, thick-headed people. So he sacrificially gave himself day by day, drop by drop, all throughout his life. And so when we talk about loving as Christ loved the church, it means following his example of that kind of sacrificial love. So consider that. Are you willing to give yourself over the long haul? In those moments when you're tired and weak, right? In those moments when you're frustrated. Again, that applies to all of us, but particularly to husbands. Are you willing to love your wife as Christ loved the church? The next characteristic that comes out in this passage is sanctifying love. You know, some people don't particularly care how their car looks as long as it gets them from place to place. But others have this deep attachment to their vehicle, right? They wash it regularly, they keep it waxed, they shine the wheels and armor all the tires. And so when they drive down the street, the last thing they want to do is drive through a muddy puddle, right? They can't stand the idea of their car being splattered with dirt. Now, we can get overly attached to material objects, but that desire to keep something clean, it gives us maybe the slightest hint of an idea about how Christ feels about our spiritual purity. There in Ephesians 5:26, take a look. Paul explained that Christ gave himself for the church. He says, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word. Now, those words that Paul uses there, they're similar to the terminology we see in the book of Leviticus, right, about sacrifice and purity and cleanliness. And the idea is that whenever we sin, whenever we disobey God, our lives are stained. They become polluted because our sins separate us from God, right? They're offensive to him. And so when Jesus died as a sacrifice for us, he did it to sanctify us, to make us holy. He did it to make us acceptable to God. Now, when you see that word there where it says in verse 26, it talks about the washing of water. And scholars debate what that means. Some think that it's talking about baptism. But I think it's probably better to say that it refers to the spiritual transformation that baptism pictures. So in Titus 3:5, for instance, Paul spoke of washing, but he specifically described it as the washing of regeneration. He speaks of Christ there, and he says, he saved us not because of works done by us in righteousness, but according to his own mercy, by the, here it is, washing of regeneration and renewal of the Holy Spirit. You see, the sacrifice of Christ, that cleansing, purifying sacrifice, is applied to our lives when we're born again, when we're regenerated. That's the moment when we're spiritually washed, we're made clean. And that comes about, he says there in Ephesians 5:26, he has that little phrase, with the word. Right? In other words, it's when we hear the message of Christ, when we hear the good news of the gospel that Jesus died for our sins and he rose again, and when we respond in faith to that word, that message, this amazing work of regeneration takes place in our lives. We're cleansed, we're washed, we're made holy. Well, what does that have to do with the way a husband loves his wife? Well, I think the idea is this. A husband has to recognize that if his wife's a Christian, if she's a believer, she belongs first and foremost to the Lord, right? Jesus gave himself to cleanse her from her sin and to make her holy. And so the last thing Jesus wants is for some guy to come along and lead that woman off into something sinful. Right? A husband should love his wife with a sanctifying love, a love that honors the sacrifice of Christ, that wants to maintain purity and holiness in that marriage. We're all supposed to love each other that way. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, as Paul talked about love in verse 6, he says it does not rejoice at wrongdoing, right? But rejoices with the truth. And so think about that. Do you have a sanctifying love for the people in your life? Is that how we love each other in the church? And if so, I mean, how much more so should that be true in a marriage? So the Christ-centered husband encourages his wife to live a pure and holy life. And do you have a sanctifying love for your wife? The third characteristic of Christ-like love here is that it's joyful. Joyful love. You know, I made some very special plans in preparation for my 20th birthday. I saved up for quite a while. I searched to find just the right gift. It was the most expensive purchase I'd ever made. And so when the day of my birthday finally arrived, it was a Wednesday night, I joyfully gave that present to someone else because I was convinced that I was getting something far better in return. And I was right. That was the day I proposed to my wife. Now, Paul's words here in Ephesians 5:27 suggest that Jesus had kind of that same idea in mind. Look at the verse. It talks about him giving himself, and then verse 27 says, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. You catch that? It's envisioning something like a wedding. Jesus had a goal. He sacrificed himself so that he would ultimately enter into this relationship with the church, that he would receive worship and adoration from people that are pure and holy because of his sacrifice. And so he approached the cross, as terrible as his suffering was, he approached it with a sense of joy. The book of Hebrews talks about that in Hebrews 12:2. Take a look. The author spoke of believers looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith. Here it is, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. See, it was as if he was looking forward to a wedding. Right? Now, other biblical passages develop that wedding analogy. Some of Jesus' parables. Matthew 22 tells us that Jesus told a parable about a wedding feast, a king giving a wedding feast for his son. And remember, in the story, the focus is on the believers are the people who respond to the invitation. The whole focus in that story is about responding to God's invitation to us. And then later on in Matthew 25, it tells us that Jesus told a parable about 10 virgins. Right? The idea is that they're bridesmaids. And they were waiting to accompany the bridegroom to his wedding feast. They had to have their oil lamps ready. Right? And so in that story, it talks of believers as if they're the wedding party. Again, waiting for Christ's return is the idea. But then in Revelation chapter 19, believers are described as the bride. John heard a great multitude, and they said this, "Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. It was granted her to clothe herself with fine linen, bright and pure, for the fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints." Right? There's this sense that we're waiting for that time, for this wedding feast, as we sang about this morning, this great feast. Now, what strikes me about that, when we think about how far we as believers stray from the path of holiness, isn't it amazing to think that Christ would delight in us? That he'd look forward to being with us, that he would take joy, that he would go to the cross with this anticipation. Now that's the power of his sanctifying love, that it overcomes our sins so that he could still take joy in us. And one day we'll be prepared, we'll be presented to him when he returns. So the point is, if Christ relates to us that way, then shouldn't a husband, a Christian husband, shouldn't he love his wife with a joyful love, with a willingness to delight in her? I mean, there will be days, right, when she may not be very lovable. But a husband's love isn't shaped, it's not determined by his wife's behavior. When he is a Christ-centered husband, his love is inspired and shaped by the love of Christ. See the difference? It's different than the way that we think about marriage. It's a Christ-centered marriage. The next characteristic we come to in Ephesians 5 is that this love, Christ's love, is a compassionate love. You know what makes a musical performance really great? I mean, a lot of musicians are technically proficient. They can play in tune. They can stay on rhythm. But I think the thing that sets one group apart from others is when they somehow manage to feel the same emotion and to express that passion together in their music. And I think true love has the same quality to it. A Christ-like love is sympathetic and it's compassionate. In other words, it's able to identify with what someone else is feeling. And that kind of connection should be strongest between a husband and a wife. Look at verse 28 here in Ephesians 5. Paul wrote, "In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself." Now, some people use that verse to say that we all need to love ourselves. But, that's not what Paul's getting at here. I mean, let's be honest. Really, our problem is that we love ourselves too much. I mean, even if we do it in a kind of self-deprecating way, think of ourselves as this martyr, we're kind of obsessed with ourselves. I mean, that's our fallen human nature. And so Paul, catch this, what he's doing here is he's calling men to treat their wives as well as they already treat themselves. We need to be so connected as husbands that we feel what our wives feel. Now again, that's not just true in marriage. We're all supposed to love each other that way. In Romans 12, verse 15, Paul said these simple words, rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. Right? That's sympathy, isn't it? That's compassion, feeling what people feel. Now, getting back to Ephesians 5:28, Paul didn't mention Christ explicitly in the passage, but notice how he began there. He said, in the same way. In other words, he's pointing back to Christ's love as it's described in verse 27. And we have to say that Jesus is the perfect, undeniable example of compassion, isn't he? He felt deep compassion for people. Matthew chapter 9, verse 36 says, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. I mean, whenever he saw people who were sick or hurting or grieving, I mean, he felt it. He identified with them. He wept. Right? His heart was stirred. Now, in a moment, down here in Ephesians 5:31, we'll see that Paul quoted from the book of Genesis to show that husband and wife become one flesh. You think of that kind of connection. If the connection between a husband and wife is that close, then guys, how can we be detached? How can we be aloof? I mean, you have to be willing to identify with your wife's emotions. Now, that doesn't mean you necessarily understand them. I get that. But it does mean you need to feel something with her, identify with her. Because that's how Christ relates to us. That's how we should relate to one another all the time, but particularly in a marriage. It's a compassionate love. The fifth characteristic we come to is a nurturing love. You know, in the Japanese art of bonsai, gardeners devote careful attention to cultivating miniature trees. It's kind of this amazing thing, right? They fastidiously prune stems and clip off leaves or needles. They use wires and clamps to shape the trunk. They water it. They fertilize it on schedule. They repot it at regular intervals. It's this big investment of time and effort. And it seems very nurturing. But the reality is that it's stifling, right? The whole goal is to prevent those trees from growing. Now, I hate to say it, but I think some marriages are kind of like bonsai trees. Yeah. I mean, on the surface, a husband can seem very devoted and caring, but what he really wants is to maintain control. Right? And so you'll see guys like that in the church, and they read Ephesians 5. Now, they know the passage, but rather than really paying attention to the part about husbands, they focus on the words directed to wives, and they use them, right, to sort of manipulate their wives. Now, we need to see this morning that nothing could be farther from Paul's intent or from Christ's example. Look at verses 29 through 30. Paul wrote, "For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body." You see, those words nourish and cherish, they speak against any attempt to stifle a woman's growth. Both of those terms are used elsewhere to talk about the way parents care for their children and raise them up. Paul uses that word that's translated nourish here. Paul uses it over in Ephesians 6:4 to talk about raising children in a way that cultivates spiritual growth and maturity. He used that word cherish. He uses it over in 1 Thessalonians 2:7 to talk about the gentle way a nursing mother cares for her child. So Paul's use of these words here, it doesn't mean that a husband has a right to be condescending or to treat his wife as a child. He must treat her as a fellow heir of God's grace and a fellow member of Christ's church. Paul's point is that he should be nurturing her spiritual growth. Now here again, that should be a given for all of us in the way that we love one another. Ephesians 4, verses 15 through 16, says rather that for believers, rather speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. So a husband should nurture his wife spiritually by sharing God's truth with her and encouraging her to deepen her relationship with Christ. Men, when you think about your love for your wife, is it something that's stifling? Is it controlling? Or are you committed to helping her grow? The sixth characteristic we see here is that this love, this Christ-like love, is exclusive. Have you ever seen a picture of a crowd where the photographer has focused in on just one individual? Right? I mean, you see the rest of the people, but they're all a little blurry. Your attention is directed to that one person. See, if we could take a picture of everyone a man loves, his wife should be the one who's in focus. She should be at the center of the picture. Other people are still in view. They're still there. He loves other people. But the Christ-centered husband has this exclusive love for his wife. Now, here in Ephesians 5:31, I mentioned this a moment ago, Paul quoted from Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. Look at what he says. He says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." Now, we've already considered that one flesh relationship should lead to compassion, right? This sense of this emotional identification. But the other point that comes out here is that the path to this relationship requires a change in the way a man relates to his parents. He has to leave, it says, and I don't think that just means where he lives. It has to do with a shift in the relationship. Now, we'll see later on in Ephesians 6 that still means honoring parents, but his wife has to be his priority. She has to take precedence. And the same is true for a wife. Her husband has to become the priority of her life. And I see it sometimes in speaking with couples. Marriages often struggle when one partner refuses to make that shift. When parents exercise too much influence over a couple's married life. See, marriage requires an exclusive love. Now, that exclusivity also has other implications. Paul talked about the exclusivity of marital love in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 16. There he quotes from Genesis 2 as he's arguing against infidelity and sexual immorality. Here's what he said. "Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the two will become one flesh." You see, he's drawing out the point. The whole part of the idea of this one flesh relationship is that it both reflects and even cultivates the sexual relationship between a husband and a wife. So any sexual activity outside of marriage, this is Paul's point here, any sexual activity outside of marriage distorts that purpose. God designed us to be monogamous, to have one partner throughout life. That's the way he created us. Now, there's another perspective on this exclusive marital love in the teaching of Jesus. Matthew 19 records that the Pharisees were quizzing Jesus about his view of divorce. Their tradition was fairly lenient. But Jesus quotes that same passage from Genesis 2 to them. And then Matthew 19:6 tells us that he says this. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. In other words, marital love should be exclusive in the sense that it's designed to be permanent. I mean, if you're truly one flesh with someone, think about the reality of that description. I mean, ripping that apart is going to be painful and destructive. Right? God doesn't want that. So husbands, love your wife exclusively. Don't let anyone else come before her. Make her the focal point of your devotion, affection, and commitment, second only to the Lord. The seventh characteristic is that this Christ-like love is exemplary. You know, I think a lot of us, and I mentioned this last week, a lot of us assume that the traditional view of marriage in our culture was biblical. And so you might look at like the reruns of old TV shows like Leave It to Beaver and think, well, that's how it ought to be. Ward and June Cleaver there. But Paul called us to something radically different than traditional marriage. As I've argued, he presented Christ as the center of a biblical marriage. And he emphasized that in Ephesians 5:32. I mean, this particular verse, I think, if we think that what Paul's talking about is just our traditional view of marriage, this verse turns that all upside down because he says this. He says, this mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. What is that about? What does Paul mean by mystery? Well, he typically uses that term to talk about something that was once hidden, but then it's revealed, it's made known. And so, for instance, back in chapter 1 of Ephesians, he spoke of God's saving purpose in Christ as a mystery. Because we understand that purpose now, but before Christ came, no one really understood that. And so here in Ephesians 5, the mystery he's pointing to is this one flesh connection between husband and wife. That's a mystery. Well, in what sense? Well, the point is that, we've known about marriage since the beginning of creation, right? We get that part of it, but Paul's point is that people didn't understand that God specifically designed marriage to reflect Christ's relationship with the church. That is God's purpose. That's why we relate to each other this way. It's to show the connection between Jesus and the church. It's not that Paul just picked up and said, oh, this is a good illustration. He's saying this was God's purpose all along. So a husband's love for his wife is supposed to be an example. It's supposed to be this object lesson to teach us about how Jesus loves us. Well, how does that work? Look, I think the Christ-centered marriage teaches us about Christ's love in three ways. First, husbands learn the depth of Christ's love as they try to imitate it. It's hard to show true love to a sinful woman, okay? And so men, in those moments when you strive to show love, but it seems undeserved or unappreciated, recognize that Jesus experiences that in a far greater way. Second, wives learn the depth of Christ's love as they experience their husband's shortcomings. It's hard to get true love from a sinful man. And so women, in those moments when your husband seems clueless about love, recognize that everything you're seeking in love, that it really comes from Jesus. Because his love is perfect. And thirdly, everyone outside of your marriage learns the depth of Christ's love as they observe your married life. Because if you're striving to have a Christ-centered marriage, people will see the difference. The humility, the love, it'll be unmistakable. Now, you won't represent him perfectly, but your marriage may be like a spark that at least prompts someone to learn more about Christ. So this love is supposed to be exemplary. And finally, characteristic 8, this love is unconditional. Sometimes I think we envision love as if it's a bridge, right? The man comes from his side, the woman comes from her, and they meet in the romantic middle. And that approach may work for about a half hour, maybe a little longer, maybe a few days, maybe even throughout somebody's time of dating and engagement. But sooner or later, what happens? One of them doesn't come to the middle anymore. They just don't feel like making the effort one day. And so what does the other person do then? Right? Does the person give up? Does the person go home and try again another day? Is that really how biblical love is supposed to work? No. When we read this final verse in Ephesians 5, verse 33, Paul presents love in unconditional terms. He said, however, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So he didn't say to husbands, love your wife when she respects you or if she respects you. He didn't say to the wife, respect your husband if he loves you, like Christ. See, no one can use those excuses. They're not there. Now, it certainly makes it easier when you can meet in the middle. That's a great thing. But both of these instructions are unconditional. God calls you to go all the way across, to do all the work, 100%. See, I think the point we so easily forget is that when you're married, you don't report to your spouse. And your spouse doesn't report to you. Your spouse is not your judge. Now, we certainly try to judge one another sometimes. That never works out well. Christ is our judge. We'll all give an account of our lives before him. And so what that means is that every husband has a God-given responsibility to love his wife, whether she deserves it or not. And Christ will hold him accountable for that. Every wife has a God-given responsibility to respect her husband, whether he deserves it or not. And Christ will hold her accountable for that. Now that's a challenging thought, right? This idea of unconditional love. But I think it's also encouraging. Because you know what it means? It means you can be a Christ-centered husband or wife, even if your spouse is not. You can display Christ's love. You can demonstrate humble submission. You can live for Christ in any and every circumstance. Even when life seems like a mess. We can honor him, we can obey him, we can serve him. And so the Christ-centered husband loves his wife as Christ loves the church. His love is sacrificial and sanctifying, joyful and compassionate, nurturing, exclusive, exemplary, and unconditional. That's God's direction for husbands. He wants us to learn to love that way, but those characteristics apply to all of us. It should be a part of all of our relationships. So what's your response today? Have you accepted Christ's love for you? I mean, do you believe that? If not, I encourage you today to believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. Enter into a relationship with him. He died for your sins. And if you're not at a point yet to take that step, I encourage you to learn more about his love. A great place to read more about Christ's love for us is John chapter 15. The night before Jesus was crucified, and he was explaining to his disciples his love for them and the kind of relationship that they could have with him. Now again, though our passage today is focused on husbands, like I've said, these lessons apply to all of us. We're all supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves. So is there some way you need to show love to someone in your life? How so? What could you do differently today to better reflect the love of Christ? Maybe there's someone you know who needs to hear about the love of Christ. Would you look for an opportunity to share God's truth with them? May God help each of us reflect the love of Christ.